So my family's roots here in the United States are pretty deep. They go all the way back to the 17th century when my family was in Massachusetts. Somewhere along the line made their way to South Carolina. My grandfather was a Baptist minister there. And then in 1823, we were living in LaPorte, Indiana, where I was born. And my father was a farmer. I didn't much care for it all that much there in the Midwest. My father had plans for me to be a farmer just like him on property right next to his. But I found the rewards of farming, both emotionally and financially, not all that great. And along with my brother Thomas, we decided that Indiana and farming wasn't going to be the life for us. So in 1845, we had heard a lot about Texas and the new republic, and how someday they wanted to be part of the United States. And Thomas and I made our way to Texas. And that fall of 1845, Texas became a state. And it seems like right away, Texas, or at least the Texans, had plans to take their boundaries of their new state a lot farther than what they had originally been granted. And the state wanted to have a militia to come help protect their new state property and to maybe make some expanded claims as well. Well, sure enough, I joined the state militia, and because I had a horse, I was able to become part of the Texas 3rd Mounted Volunteers. And in April of 1846, war broke out with Mexico. Well, expansionist policy seemed to be the norm of the day. The current boundaries of Texas stopped about 150 miles north of the Rio Grande, an area called the Nueces area. Seemed like most Texans thought that was part of our state. So we immediately made advances towards the Rio Grande. Now the 3rd Texas Mounted Cavalry was actually part of a larger unit. Our division was headed by the governor of the state, Governor Pinckney Henderson, who took a leave of absence to lead us, and we joined a larger contingent headed by the U.S. Army by a man by the name of Zachary Taylor. He became 12th President of the United States. Well, we had about 6,000 men, and we advanced towards the Rio Grande. We engaged the Mexican enemy at a battle and won decisively against General Arista and his forces. We continued our advance on into Mexico, where we descended upon the rather large town called Monterey. Well, Zachary Taylor, the general, I guess he was flushed with confidence by our success there on the Rio Grande. And we engaged the enemy there at Monterey, a much larger force, before our supply lines had the opportunity to catch up with us. We engaged the enemy, we fought hard, but very quickly we began to run short on ammunition. And it was there that I had the good fortune to see a real brave lieutenant in the U.S. Army who rode through the fire to find the quartermaster to let him know we needed more ammunition. His name was Lieutenant Ulysses Grant. You may have read in the papers here in 1863, he's making a name for himself now, fighting in that war we're now fighting against those rebels of the southern states. Well, Taylor, by engaging us so quickly with a much larger force, that battle didn't go as fast, and we fought for about a week. I distinguished myself helping to hold a crossroads, an important one, against heavy enemy fire. But we could tell we were finally starting to gain the upper hand on General Arrudia and his forces. We were on a high ground. We had heard that the Mexicans wanted to negotiate, perhaps talk about a surrender. On the high ground, I saw Taylor and his men head toward the headquarters of the Mexican army. After several hours of quiet, we noticed the Mexican army gather in a great column with their rifles and cannons intact and headed off south towards Mexico. Word quickly spread that Taylor had not negotiated a surrender, but an armistice instead. He let the enemy get completely away, fully armed. Now, I've heard when President Polk found out what General Taylor had done, he was furious. He said Taylor's job was not to negotiate, but to kill the enemy. Well, there was more fighting to be done. The army was determined to take Mexico City as part of our victory we had hoped for in the Mexican War. Polk was so disappointed in Taylor, he told our army to stay put in Monterrey, and he sent General Winfield Scott and about 12,000 soldiers down to Veracruz, where they marched on Mexico City and eventually vanquished the Mexican army successfully, and we won our war. Me, I spent the rest of the Mexican War rather ingloriously there in Monterrey as an occupier and not a fighting soldier. Well, our war of imperialism, our Mexican-American war we fought, it finally finished in 1848, and we certainly achieved our objective of acquiring a lot more land for our country. Now, this was also the time California was a prize, because gold had been discovered in December of 1848 and announced by General Polk and told to President Polk and told to the world. Thomas and I returned to Indiana. We did the best we could for a while, but wanderlust set in, and we heard so much about the many promises of California. Thomas and I decided that's where we would go, and in 1850 off to California we headed. When I first got to the great state of California, I first located in the area one of the queen of the mining camps called Sonora. Very successful town. And it was very quickly after arriving there that I got in a fair amount of trouble, if you will. You see, there were large landowners that really weren't that interested in mining their property. But they were interested in making money if someone else was going to mine it. There was one gentleman that had a lot of his land turned into agriculture. He agreed to turn over on a lease basis to a number of prospectors and miners to look for gold on his property there in Sonora. Well, I don't need to bother you with the details tonight, but let me tell you, a fight broke out between the owner of the property and men that supported him and some of the prospectors that thought they didn't have to honor any kind of agreement and just go onto the land as they pleased. It was a hell of a bloodbath. 3 people died. 12 people were indicted as conspirators of this event, including myself. I can tell you I had nothing to do with it other than merely being there and having my own firearm. But when I heard I was indicted, I thought I should find better climes, and I left the Sonora area and headed further south. I was never formally arrested or served any time, but I'll tell you, that disturbed the good folks of Sonora pretty readily. They were concerned for a very long time. People would arm themselves and barricade themselves in their house for fear of someone trying to make bad things happen on their property as well. It became known as the Holden Garden Affair. Some call it the Holden Garden Riot. The 1849, 50, 51 was a wild time in California. Prospectors have a tendency to not honor property rights and to go where they please, to look for that precious mineral that they're all looking for. That was the basis of the Holden Garden affair, and it was also the basis of the infringement upon many Indians that lived in the area with their property as well. The miners weren't known to be the most polite bunch, and if they thought there was gold to be found on any Indian property, they didn't hesitate to go look for it, no matter who claimed ownership to the land. Some of the local folks there, the Indians named Awanichi, took a little bit of offense to that. Some of the miners were extremely rude and did violence and other irregularities against the Awanichi and other Indians that lived in the area, including their women. Well, I can't blame them, but some of the Awanichi took revenge on what had been done to them and killed a few of the miners. That began more of the Indian skirmishes there in the gold country. A Lieutenant Treadwell that had helped create a small army station there to help enforce what laws might have existed in the time. Well, he decided he would go find the Awanichi and punish them accordingly, so he said. He followed the Merced River up towards what you might know now as Yosemite Valley, which was the home of the Awanichi at the time. And when they found out he was coming, they headed further and deeper into the High Sierra and across on over to the other side, here to the area known now today as Lake Mono. Well, when Treadwell returned to Mariposa, where I was now living, he talked that he had actually found some yellow in some of the creeks and ravines of the Lake Mono area. In the saloon, we heard stories of Treadwell talking about he might have found some precious minerals here, not having a lot of luck there in the Mono Lake in the Mariposa area. I and some other prospectors there in Mariposa thought we should give it a try and make our own way across the mountains and see if the dirt there might prove more profitable than what we were finding there in Mariposa. We headed our way across the great valley of Yosemite. If you've never been there, let me urge you to do so. A place of any greater beauty, I think I have never seen. We headed through the valley on into the higher mountains and into the pass that dropped down here to Lake Mono. It was a rough route. If you would see it, you would think surely pack animals cannot possibly make their way down such a difficult route such as that. And the bleached bones of many horses and mules and the stench of another said that my assumption was probably true. It dropped 3,000 feet in 4 miles over narrow ledges and deep canyons and rocky terrain. It was the most difficult route. The first man that took horses or mules across there was a brave man indeed. It became known as Bloody Canyon, and it was an appropriate name for most of the livestock of animals that would cross would get severely cut by the rocks and other sharp objects on the trail, leaving a trail of blood along the way. Bloody Canyon indeed. Well, we made our way here to Lake Mono. It was very beautiful. We saw some yellow in the ground, but not much. We ended up going back to Mariposa, rather empty-handed. When I got there, I'd heard that there was a horse thief by the name of Joaquin Murrieta that was causing all kinds of grief in the gold country. And because I wasn't making a lot of money mining gold at the time, I perked up when I heard there was a $5,000 reward for anybody that could capture Mr. Murrieta. Well, we had heard he was in our area, and I joined a group of others there in Mariposa, and we had him cornered in a house. I had my rifle pointed right out his only exit, and when he did, it didn't fire. Murrieta got away.
And so did $5,000. I'm sure your companions were quite pleased with you.
Shortly after that, about 1854, while drinking in my favorite drinking establishment called the El Dorado Saloon there in Mariposa, this one John Ross, who had over and imbibed that night, he got rather belligerent and took me on in a very intoxicated manner. He was so intoxicated, he was no challenge for me to rough up a little bit, send him on his way. Well, I guess his pride was sullied when he sobered up the next morning, and he sought me out and challenged me to a duel. I would turn my back on no such foolishness, and I accepted. Ross and I and others, we marched out into a field south of Mariposa. The preliminaries were set, but before we could engage each other in a battle, well, Constable Harvig showed up. He had heard about it, and he arrested both of us. I served no time and served no court action, but I didn't have to engage in the duel, and I was on my way. I had begun to make enough money by 1855, a little prospecting here, some success with the gold mineral, that I actually had saved enough to buy that same saloon, the El Dorado Saloon there in Mariposa. It was a beautiful establishment. It was a place where men could come and play billiards to discuss and solve the problems of the day, to sit and listen to the piano player that would play all of our favorite tunes.
And by being the owner, you were able to enjoy as much libations as you cared.
That was a benefit of owning the saloon. You're right indeed. In between prospecting, men get bored. Wagers are common occurrences, and often we would get together and decide upon the swiftness of certain animals that lived there in Mariposa. Horse racing, you might call it. People would wager upon that. There was property to the south of town, and we were rather actively involved in the horse racing business for a while. And it was during this time, I'm sorry. Go ahead. In the horse racing business.
I once placed a bet on a horse to come in 10-1, and he did. But the unfortunate thing is, the other horse came in around noon.
So it was about this time that I met Miss Sadie. She had what some people called the gift of gab. I noticed when Sadie was hanging around my saloon that my patrons, many of them, seemed to stick around longer and enjoy more beverages as well. Ever since that time, Miss Sadie has mostly been in my employ and occasionally under my sheets ever since. I had watched the animals haul the heavy freights there in the gold country. Horses and mules strained, pulling these huge weights of wagons of supplies and ore. And I noticed it took what seemed like a legion of horses and mules to handle the freight. And the horses and mules, they needed to eat. They needed a place to be taken care of. I knew the man at the livery stable, and it was expensive to take care of so many animals. I, along with a man by the name of Overton, first over drinks, then over pencil and paper, we began to put plans together. And sure enough, we came up with a wagon that would be powered by steam, eliminating the need to have all these horses and mules pull them. It was a great idea, and I made plans to go to Washington, D.C. to file a patent on it, and if I couldn't make enough money on mining gold, maybe that patent for my steam engine powered wagon would do so. But you know how it is. Sometimes life
And alcohol.
get in the way of the best laid plans, and I never made my way to Washington to register my patent. You may be familiar, a few years ago in 1856, an arrogant ex-soldier named John C. Fremont ran for president as a new party Republican. Fremont had fought in the Mexican War in California as well. And 1 year before the Mexican War broke out, Fremont, for a very small amount of money, claimed he had purchased over 40,000 acres of land from the Mexican governor of Alta California at that time. And that land lay mostly north and through the town of Mariposa. Land that had already been worked by hundreds, if not thousands, of miners and prospectors. Well, around the middle 1850s, Fremont filed in court action, saying everyone should get off his property, that he laid claim to the entire 40,000 plus acres of valuable California foothill gold lands. Well, those things ended up in court, but I would not let my fellow citizens there in Mariposa be bullied by any politician. We held meetings nightly at my El Dorado saloon, organizing the resistant effort to that arrogant SOB Fremont. In the fall of 1857, we had heard that a gentleman by the name of Carl Norse, a prospector that had hung around in the Mariposa area for a while, that he had discovered a fairly decent-sized vein of precious gold north of here in the ravines about 9 to 10 miles away. As soon as people on the other side heard, well, the rush was on. And several dozens, if not maybe a couple of hundred people, made their way over to this area of the ravine north of here. As was common, people were in such a hurry to find their gold that no real buildings were built. They just merely gathered the rocks they had dug through in the creek, arranged some hovels. They lived very primitively, almost like in squalor.
Those men, they lived like dogs. The settlement became called Dogtown.
It was a remote area, and hearing of the success there, I, of course, made my way there as well. We were so far away from anywhere that supplies were often very short in having. In fact, I had what turned to be a near fatal tragedy happen to me. I went 8 months without once being able to take a drink of whiskey. In February of 1858, the snows fall in great amounts, and the supplies started to run lower and lower in Dogtown. I gathered a group of 5 or so of the strongest men in town, and I told them we must do something to alleviate the pain of our fellow citizens. We made crude snowshoes. The snow was over 5 feet deep there in Dogtown alone. We got a sled that we could be pulled along the snow, and the 5 of us made our way north to Carson City, which had supplies at that time. We were able to bring those supplies back. Took us 10 days. But I think the heroism of my fellow men and myself, we saved the lives of numerous people there in Dogtown.
And you saved your own sanity by bringing back many bottles of whiskey.
Yes, Sadie, that's true. When we were in Dogtown, we weren't sure if we were in California or maybe we were in Utah territory. And if we were in Utah territory, that means we would be placed under the jurisdiction of those self-righteous Brigham Young and his Mormons. Many of us there in Dogtown were opposed to any such thing. So we gathered together and decided we would have our own meeting, later called a convention of getting together, because if we were in Utah territory, we wanted our section to be a different state, so we would not be under their jurisdiction.
I think your concern was that the Latter-day Saints would not allow alcohol in their territory.
That was one consideration, indeed. So we held our territorial convention there in Genoa, where we began the process of Nevada becoming its own territory and eventually a state, we hope. Not long after the discovery there in Dogtown, gold was found just up the road from where we are here today. And there was a lot more of it there than there was at Dogtown. Over 700 people made their way, became known as Monoville. There was a much better sense of community there as well. Very quickly, there was at least a dozen saloons and several dry goods stores as well. The promise of gold in the land and the ground was so good that they actually diverted a creek high up in the canyon, brought the creek over the divide, fed it into another canal, brought it down the mountain, stored it in a reservoir, and created a gravity system that provided pretty decent hydraulic pressure to help us wash the hillsides away to look for the gold that we might find. Well, it was while there, I, of course, explored other canyons and ravines around this entire great basin of Lake Mono. And I found a place at the mouth of the canyon here that suited me just fine. I found no promise of gold, but it was fairly level, meadowlands, forest lands, and a very large creek flowing through it. I filed my claim on it, and it became Vining Ranch. With all the beautiful sunshine, the abundant water, and the fertile soils, I was able to grow most every piece of vegetable that grew in California. I constructed enough buildings there that I invited the men from Monoville. Prospecting and gold panning gets pretty hard and pretty tedious. And believe it or not, those men needed a place to go from time to time to rest and relax, and I made them all welcome at my property. I also took advantage of the very large creek, Vining Creek, that ran through our property, and I had constructed a crude sawmill because the water from the flow of the creek easily powered my mill. There's not much lumber there at Monoville. I was able to cut enough lumber to help build several of the houses and other buildings that the men needed up there in that area.
And the saloon, your saloon.
And as a bit of a side business, I had one of the 12 saloons there in Monoville as well that did relatively well at first until the winter of 1859-60, so much snow fell that it actually collapsed the saloon.
And I was forced to work at another thirst parlor.
I hired a good deal of local people to work on my property, helping me grow the crops and run my mill. Not the prospectors, but there were a number of Mono Paiute Indians that lived here. Very hardworking and very industrious. Certainly compared to my Euro-American neighbors who were so lazy that most of them would be late to their own funeral. I found the Paiute very hardworking. They helped work the mill, they helped grow the crops, and they lived a fairly full and fruitful life here at Mono Lake. They built their shelters out of willow poles, used willow brushes and sagebrush to help insulate them and pull them off. They built large pits in the bottom of their shelters with a hole through the top for their fires for cooking and warmth. During the winters, when the cold and snows would come, they moved to the east side of the lake where it was less snowy and less snowy and warmer as well. They did beautiful work with baskets. If you have ever seen the work of our local Indians that live here, it's really something quite to behold. They help provide for the economy here in the Mono Basin quite well. They would harvest eggs from the gulls, which made, of course, tasty and delicious omelets. They harvested the flower larvae that they could find along the lakes, which created abundant food for their own sources. They would harvest the pine nuts off the trees, which provided for a flour and other material that helped provide sustenance as well. They were extremely hardworking. They made out of rabbits and deer skins for moccasins and robes that they would have as well. They were wonderful people that lived here in this area.
Mono, the rattlesnake.
As far as food goes, in these mountains where Monoville is at, there's also a lot of rattlesnakes that live there. Sometimes they would catch you off guard and give you a bite. Maybe you'd meet your demise. They were big. Some of them were as big around as my arm. I found they made a pretty tasty meal if you could get the jump on them before they got the jump on you.
I think it tasted like chicken.
The area up here has become known as the Rattlesnake Hills. Well, by about 1860, more prospectors looking for that ever-elusive precious gold. About 15 miles north and east of here in these dry desert mountains this direction. More gold was found, and this, by first reports, had great promise, which created a huge amount of hope. By 1861, there was already 1,400 people living in this town called Aurora. Well, of course, once I heard about it, I had to make my own way there and find out for myself what was going on. It was indeed, when I got there, there was a definite sense of permanence that you never saw in Dogtown or Monaville. Structures were made out of not only wood, but out of brick. Many thriving businesses, people coming and going, many reports of finding great amounts of gold in the ground. Well, I bought myself 3 claims. And I ended up selling my property here in Vining Canyon, so I could spend most of my time there in Aurora finding what profits I could be made in that location. The boundary there in Aurora, whether we were in Nevada territory or California, it wasn't clear. A real good survey had not been done. California claimed it to be part of its state. In fact, it was the county seat of Mono County. Yet the folks in Nevada said, no, it's part of Esmeralda County in Nevada territory, and they made the seat for their county as well. On the election of 1862, if you lived in Aurora, you could go to the local sheriff's office and vote for issues and candidates in California, and head down the street to the Miners Hall and vote for candidates in Nevada as well. The boundary dispute there in that area, it is so interesting, far beyond my storytelling and time I have tonight. I hope someday someone will write a book about the state boundary there, because it's a very interesting and worthwhile subject. By 1863, the population of Aurora had swelled to 3,000 people. They even had two churches. It was so civilized there. The Masons were there. The Oddfellows were there. It seemed like the promise of Aurora being a permanent and good established town that would last forever was great. Well, the evening's getting late, and I suppose that I should be thinking about heading on down the road and bring my long-winded ramblings to an end. And I hope that I haven't violated, with my ramblings, one of those properties of physics or speech giving. I get confused. You see, light travels faster than sound. And that's why some people appear brighter before they start talking. I have had a rich and full life. I have traveled great expanses of this country and had many wonderful experiences. And I hope that someday I make a fairly decent living with my prospecting and other adventures that I have as well. And though I now no longer own my Vining Ranch, it is my hope that someday, perhaps on my claims in Aurora, that I will make enough money to where I can come back to the Lake Mono area and buy property again and call it home. It is such a beautiful land. I can't imagine that there'll be many more people than myself that will want to call such a beautiful place home. And who knows? Maybe there'll be enough people someday here to actually have a town. And maybe they'll call it and name it after me. I hope you've enjoyed our time together here this evening. I wish you all safe travels and the best of fortune. Thank you.
Exact details are a bit murky, but on April 25th, 1863, while enjoying a beverage at the Aurora Saloon, Lee had an accidental discharge of a small pistol he kept in his trousers and shot himself through the groin. Within 36 hours, Leroy was dead. He was remembered by a very well-attended funeral with numerous tributes and testimonies offered. In the early 1920s, Mono Basin pioneers Chris Matley and Gus Hess subdivided land they owned near Leroy's former ranch. The area was known by the locals as Poverty Flats, but thinking a more appealing name would be better attract buyers for their lots, they called their new settlement Lakeview. By 1926, enough people had moved into the new town that Matley petitioned the U.S. government to create a post office there. But the Postal Service advised Matley that the name Lakeview was already taken. And after a bit of thought, Matley changed the name to Leroy Vining. And this delightful community has been known by such ever since. Thank you.